The call came through the way most important calls did in 1971. Not to Marvin directly, but to the people around him. A producer, an assistant, someone whose job it was to translate the language of television into something an artist could act on. The message was simple enough on the surface. Dick Clark's people wanted Marvin Gaye on American Bandstand. They'd seen the numbers on what's going on. They knew the album was moving, and they wanted a piece of it. On paper, this should have been good news. American Bandstand wasn't just a television show. It was a mechanism, the most reliable mechanism in the country for turning a regional hit into a national conversation. Clark had been running it since 1952, and in nearly 2 decades, he had built something that functioned less like entertainment and more like infrastructure. If your song played on Bandstand, it crossed lines that soul radio couldn't cross. It entered living rooms in Iowa and Oregon and suburban New Jersey. It reached the white teenagers whose record-buying habits the industry tracked with religious precision. For a black artist in 1971, getting that kind of exposure still meant something real and specific. It meant you'd made it past a door that didn't open for everyone. But Marvin had learned over a decade inside the Motown machine that doors with that much weight on them always had conditions attached. The meeting that followed, between Marvin's people and Clark's people, was the kind of meeting that never appears in official biographies because nothing in it was technically said. Nobody threatened Marvin. Nobody handed him a list of demands. The language was softer than that because soft language was the house style of the music industry, and Clark's operation was very much part of that industry. What got communicated, through careful phrasing and reasonable-sounding concern, was this. The show's audience had a particular relationship with their Saturday afternoons. They came to Bandstand for energy, for dancing, for the feeling of a song that moved through them without asking too much. The album Marvin had made, this beautiful, heavy, complicated thing, wasn't exactly that. The anti-war material, the grief in it, the streets, the tear gas, the letter to the brother overseas. It was extraordinary, yes, but extraordinary wasn't always what the room wanted. Could Marvin do something from earlier in his catalog? Something people already knew and loved? The subtext was not subtle. They wanted his voice. They didn't want his message. And somewhere in that distinction was the oldest argument in American popular music. The argument about what black artistry was allowed to mean when it crossed into spaces built by and for white audiences. Marvin listened to all of this. He was good at listening. People who spent time around him during that period often described the same quality. A stillness in difficult conversations that could fool you into thinking he was agreeable. He'd sit with something, absorb it, let the silence do the work, and then he would do exactly what he'd already decided to do before the conversation started. He didn't say yes. He also didn't make a scene of saying no. He thanked Clark's people. He kept things professional. He left without giving them a commitment. That particular form of refusal, quiet, undramatic, utterly final, was something Marvin had been practicing for years. He'd used it with Berry Gordy when Gordy initially refused to release What's Going On at All. He'd used it with producers who wanted to put strings on everything and sand down the edges of his voice. He understood on some deep level that the most powerful thing he could do in a room full of people who wanted him to be smaller was simply to not become smaller. No argument required. No declaration, just the absence of capitulation. What he did instead was go back to work. This was 1971, and Marvin's studio was the one place where the terms were his. Not Gordy's, not Clark's, not the industry's. His. He'd fought to get that. Fight being almost too clean a word for the years of erosion and negotiation and near breakdown that had preceded What's Going On. The album had come from a specific kind of desperation. The desperation of a man who felt that if he made one more hit single designed to make somebody else comfortable, something essential in him would stop working. He had looked at the music he was being asked to make and understood, with the clarity that sometimes only arrives at the edge of collapse, that it wasn't enough, that it was never going to be enough. So he had made something different, something true, and the truth was already doing what truth does when you stop trying to manage it. It was spreading on its own. The letters had started arriving before the album even finished its first month. Not fan mail in the conventional sense. These were handwritten things from Vietnam veterans who had come home to find their country had moved on without them. From mothers in Detroit and Baltimore who didn't have a word for what they were watching happen to their neighborhoods. From young men in places Motown's promotional machinery had never thought to reach, writing to say that what's going on had found them anyway, that they'd heard it on a base in Southeast Asia, that they'd cried in a parking lot, that something in the music had named a feeling they'd been carrying without knowing it had a name. Dick Clark's audience, his producers had explained, wasn't ready for that kind of weight. The country, as it turned out, already was. What's Going On entered the Billboard R&B chart in May 1971 and spent 2 weeks at #1. More surprisingly, it crossed over, not because anyone had programmed it for crossover success, but because the music had a gravity that pulled people toward it, regardless of where the industry had decided it was supposed to land. Critics who had covered soul music as a commercial genre and nothing more started writing about the album in different language. They used words like visionary. They compared it to things that had never been compared to Motown before. Rolling Stone paid attention. Time paid attention. The record entered the conversation about what American music could carry and how much of the truth it was allowed to tell. None of this happened because Dick Clark played it on Saturday afternoon. The thing about the gatekeeping system Clark represented, and it's important to say he represented it well and in good faith because he genuinely believed in what he was doing, is that it works on an assumption. The assumption is that audiences need to be managed, that the distance between a piece of art and the people it's meant to reach has to be measured and controlled, that without the filter, the audience would be confused or overwhelmed or alienated. Clark had built his entire career on that assumption, and for 20 years it had held. He'd helped break Elvis. He'd given television homes to artists who became defining figures of their era. The filter had real uses, but the filter also had a blind spot. It couldn't account for music that didn't need permission to reach people. Music that arrived in the bones before the brain had a chance to decide whether it was appropriate. What's Going On was that kind of music. The kind that makes gatekeeping irrelevant, not by breaking down the gate, but by making the gate's location beside the point. Marvin hadn't gone around Clark's system. He'd operated in a completely different geography. The people who needed the album didn't need Bandstand to find it. They found it the way people find things that are made for them, inevitably through channels that have nothing to do with industry infrastructure. Clark gave interviews in this period about his responsibility to his audience. He was thoughtful about it. He talked about the importance of accessibility, about meeting people where they were, about the particular social function of a show that reached so many different kinds of American families. He was sincere, and sincerity doesn't make a man wrong about everything. Clark understood television, understood his audience, understood the economics of attention in a way that was genuinely sophisticated. But there was one thing he got wrong, and Marvin's silence in that meeting was the correction. He got wrong the idea that the heaviness was the obstacle. The heaviness was the point. The reason What's Going On lasted, the reason it's still being cited, still being taught, still being discovered by people who weren't born when it was made, is precisely because Marvin refused to take the weight out of it. A lighter version of that album would have been a pleasant record. It would have moved units. It might even have done well on Bandstand. And then it would have belonged to 1971 in the way that most pleasant records belong to their years, as artifacts, as nostalgia, as sounds that remind you of a particular summer. What's Going On doesn't work like that. It belongs to every year. It belongs to now, because the things it was about, the grief of war, the failure of institutions, the particular exhaustion of loving a country that hasn't decided yet whether it loves you back, those things didn't stay in 1971. They traveled forward. Marvin didn't make a statement about any of this. That wasn't his style. He was too internal for public declarations, too private for the kind of confrontation that makes for clean narrative. What he did was continue. He went back into the studio. He made more music. He lived with the consequences, the ongoing battles with Motown, the financial wreckage of his personal life, the depression that never fully lifted, and he kept working. Not because he had resolved anything, but because the work was the only place where he didn't have to perform being okay. Years later, when journalists asked him how What's Going On had happened, He consistently deflected the heroic framing. He didn't talk about bravery, he talked about necessity, about there being no other option that felt honest. The familiar sound, the comfortable performance, the song designed for a Saturday afternoon, all of it felt to him like a form of vanishing. And he had already spent too much of his career vanishing into what other people needed him to be. Dick Clark's name doesn't come up when people trace the lineage of soul music after 1971. Marvin's does. The gatekeepers had the gate, Marvin had the music. And in the end, music that's built from something real doesn't need a gate. It needs a listener. And listeners, it turned out, were everywhere, in every city, in every tax bracket, on every side of every demographic line the industry had drawn. They were waiting for something that told the truth without apologizing for it. Marvin gave them that, not on a Saturday afternoon television stage, under fluorescent lights, performing a smaller version of himself for an audience someone else had decided he should want. He gave it in a studio, alone, making the only thing he knew how to make once he stopped trying to make what they asked for. The room where that decision happened wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no moment where Marvin stood up and said something that silenced everyone. He just didn't become what they needed him to be. And that turned out to be enough. Have you ever been told your truth was too much for someone else's comfort and made it anyway? Tell us in the comments.